Hi, my name is Nicole Herbert. I am a teacher licensure student in the teacher licensing program at UNC Asheville. This is my video journal for my Education 346 field experiences in the ESL classroom, observing English language learners. For my ESL placements this semester, I observed Miss Young's 7th and 8th grade ESL classes at Irwin Middle School in Asheville, North Carolina. On average, I observed three different groups, three different periods, if you will, or groups of classes on two separate occasions. On average, each of Miss Young's classes had between 6 to 10 students. The students come from very diverse backgrounds. A wealth of languages are spoken in Miss Young's ESL classes, ranging from Spanish to Russian, German, Ukrainian, Romanian. One student spoke a little known Micronesian language. Some students very newly arrived from the Buncombe County Newcomer Centers. Also, some students have been living in the United States for quite some time, some even born in the United States, but their English skills are they're not testing high enough to no longer be eligible for these ESL services. And so in place of their UA, or their sort of UA stands for Unified Arts. They're the kind of electives that students take in middle school. So these include courses such as Spanish, music, choir, band, art, drama. So those are students' UAs. Students in the ESL program at Irwin Middle School attend ESL courses in place of in place of their UA. Not by choice. So that's one of the first things I'll comment on observing Miss Young's classroom. She very much creates a fun, inviting, and encouraging classroom environment. She knows that her students are missing out on the fun electives that their peers are getting because of their language needs, their English language needs. And so her classroom environment is, she just creates this classroom that is very reward centered, very much so, very much so. So what are they studying? In the two separate class days that I observed Miss Young students, I observed students, the first day I attended, students were studying reading strategies, and specifically they were looking at the strategies of summarizing a reading passage, identifying main idea, and identifying key points and supporting details. And the second day I observed, students were working on, they had just completed a project on body systems, and so Miss Young was facilitating a Kahoot game that helped sort of test and reinforce their knowledge on the body systems that they had been studying in the previous weeks. She uses a lot. I only spent 4 hours observing Miss Young. Actually, 5. I spent 5 hours observing Miss Young. How would I characterize the types of activities that she worked with? So she used Kahoot, so very interactive, very interactive. Her whole lesson is incredibly interactive. It's very teacher, student, 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 teacher, sort of like that's how the discussion dynamic works. It's not just teacher, 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 student, teacher, 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 student in terms of who's speaking or who has the floor, but very much teacher, student, 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 teacher, student, teacher, student, student, if that makes sense. So her students are very engaged in the classroom discussion. I will say that observing her facilitating reading, this lesson on reading strategies, right? So the article that they read was about summer camps specifically designed for children with certain types of developmental disabilities or chronic illnesses. And so she started off the class by asking her students if they had ever experienced a summer camp, if they had ever attended summer camp, or if they knew what summer camps were. And many students had. And then she asked them, what kinds of activities do you do at summer camp? And then the students shared. Many of the students had gone ziplining in their summer camp, so then she shared an experience about ziplining in Costa Rica. They talk about the kinds of fun activities that you do at summer camps, and then they talk about what is chronic illness, what does it mean to have a disease or a chronic illness, what does it mean to have some kind of disability, and then they dug into the reading. And they did a read aloud in class. Students volunteered to read, and then she demonstrated on the board how to sort of annotate or mark the texts that they were working with. So that was another strategy that they were working on. It wasn't listed in the learning objectives for the day, but it was certainly the skill that they were practicing and cultivating, was how to annotate a text, how to mark a text in such a way that you can easily reference the main idea and the supporting details. And they practiced writing in the margins summaries, are sort of reframing or re-articulation of that main idea for each paragraph and the supporting details for each paragraph. So the materials that she used in her classroom I observed her using technology when she facilitated a Kahoot game. I also observed her utilizing pens, markers, conversation with students. She also used some visual images, so she pulled up a picture of a zip line in order to demonstrate to students what a zip line was, because she was having difficulty translating. So Miss Young speaks some Spanish, and so she's able to translate for students who are for new arrivals from the Buncombe County Newcomers Center who are fluent in Spanish. And a lot of the other students speak Spanish in the class as well, so they can also help. However, there's this one student, pretty newly arrived from the Buncombe County Newcomer Center with a very low English language proficiency. This student spoke this Micronesian islands language, one that a specific language that I'm not familiar with. And so Miss Young and the other students in the class were unable to explain what zipline and summer camp were to this student. And so Miss Young looked up on the internet photos to show the student, like, this is what we're talking about, and demonstrated on the text which specific words she was referencing. The students seemed very motivated in her class and engaged. They seem to have a respect for her, and she very much seems to have a respect for them as well. Students seemed to respond to her style of teaching. They were so engaged and in her classes, so participatory in the discussions, so willing to offer answers. I think part of that is because of the way she uses, and the way all the teachers at Irwin use the PBIS, or Positive Behavior Intervention Reward System, right? So every time a student contributes in class discussion, they get a little ticket. And each teacher uses those tickets a little differently, but the way Miss Young uses them is that students get rewards immediately in that class session if they choose, or they can hold on to them and cash them in at the end of the week. So they get candy, they get special privileges, such as sitting in the special comfy chair that's in the sort of off to the side in the classroom. They get to have their technology out during class. They get a wristband they can trade a certain number of tickets in for a wristband, which gives them, which they can use to be entered into a drawing for a larger prize from the school, as well as wristbands also grant a certain number of extra privileges, such as homework passes and I think like early dismissal at the end of the day, a couple minutes early to head towards the bus or whatever. You're allowed to sit at any table in the cafeteria. So those rewards vary quite a bit. One of the greatest successes I would say that I observed in Miss Young's classroom was her ability to use students L1. So for her Spanish-speaking students, Miss Young, who herself she's a native English speaker, minored in Spanish in college, spent a lot of time, she studied abroad in Latin America while she was in college, and then after college she did another stay in Latin America with a host family. And so she's proficient enough in Spanish that she's able to draw upon that linguistic background in order to build upon her students' primary language, right? She's able to engage their L1 in order to help them build proficiency in their L2. And I really saw that working with her, both in terms of the relationships that she's building with students and the ways in which she's able to use her Spanish-speaking abilities to have some kind of influence over student affect, as well as her ability to just reframe the material, like reframe her instructions or rephrase course concepts in a way that students can understand a little differently, right, when the information is being presented to them in their native language. It's really difficult for me to say what I might change or adapt. It's really difficult. One of the things I observed, so my first visit to Miss Young's classroom was right after having read the Goldenberg article on English language learning proficiency. And I remember Goldenberg saying in that article that it's not very useful to spend a whole lot of time with English language learners, helping them to develop reading strategies. So I was that was very present for me as I was observing the lesson that Miss Young was facilitating, where she was essentially teaching and reinforcing strategies for reading. But I would say that, that lesson seemed successful to me, if for no other reason because the students were engaged throughout the entire process. And I think that, learning to and having the opportunity to practice annotating a text is a huge skill that's going to serve for life, right? It's a huge test-taking strategy and college survival skill. Certainly will be necessary throughout high school, and is really beneficial for all students. But that being said, just the idea that rather than getting the opportunity to participate in art, students in the ESL classroom are in a position where the instruction and the curriculum in the ESL classroom looks very much like the curriculum and instruction in the other core subject areas throughout the school day. So this isn't something that Miss Young can change, right? Because this is sort of like an institutional or a school-wide or even a county-wide or much larger sort of course structure. But to have these ESL courses not sort of replace or take students away from other kinds of fun, experiential learning opportunities they could have. You don't want for ESL instruction to feel to students as though it's a punishment. So that's something that I would change if I was perhaps a school administrator, or if I was an ESL teacher, I might advocate for a slightly different structure or model in my school. Certainly if I was in some kind of leadership position, say I was on some committee, steering committee, school improvement committee or something, I might really advocate to sort of envision the place of ESL instruction a little differently within the school. The strongest or the largest adaptation of the curriculum that I saw Miss Young using was repetition, using visual images to reinforce vocabulary, repetition to reinforce vocabulary, and attempts to translate terms. And so fortunately there, for example, in one class there were 2 Russian speakers, and one of these Russian speakers was also fluent in Romanian and Ukrainian, but that student was also fluent in Russian, and so was another student who was from Russia, and so those 2 students could speak a little bit to one another in Russian. And they weren't sitting at the same table, they were in fact sitting on opposite sides of the room, but sometimes when one student had a question, then the other student would respond in Russian, and then she would say, oh, okay, I get it now. And for Miss Young to allow that and to sort of accommodate that, there's a strong history of English language instruction in the United States being very vehemently English only, right? And not really allowing for linguistic diversity in the classroom, and that is an adaptation that Miss Young makes for her students. And the same with her Spanish speakers. Spanish speakers were, translating concepts into Spanish, so as not to make the material, so as not to bar those students with less proficiency from accessing the course concepts. Or the concepts of the day. I think that sums it up. I've touched on everything. Yeah, a real delight to observe. I'm glad I got the opportunity to spend time in a middle school ESL class. It would have been interesting to observe another ESL teacher. The one that Miss Young's classroom was very different from the classroom I observed at the Buncombe County Newcomer Center, and it would have been really interesting to observe even another classroom. But yeah, that concludes my video journal on my field experiences in Miss Young's English language learning class at Irwin Middle School.